Province House wrap, Premier Stephen McNeil is doing what has become custom for him, and that's taking off to the Far East for trade trips. He's going back to China for what will be his 8th trip. He's also making stops in South Korea and Japan. But beyond that, we don't know a whole lot about these trips. Something else that's become a bit of a custom before he leaves.
Absolutely. We know we don't have an itinerary. We don't know specifically who he'll be meeting with, and we don't know who else is going on this trip because clearly the Premier doesn't travel alone. He gave us a rough idea of the kind of meetings he has, but certainly not to the level of detail that I think would make us, as he has promised in the past, to be the most open and accountable government in the country.
Right, and there may be an update right before he leaves on Thursday about the trips, and so we may get some more details then. But this has become a bit of a trend with the Premier in that he'll go on these trips, and often notice of those trips will be at the last minute and details will be very scant. Usually they don't get provided until after he's back, and even then getting details about specifically who was on those trips can be a challenge. And given that we, the public, are the ones paying for these trips, it should be a matter of course that this information is released, and really it ought to be released even before he leaves.
And it wasn't that long ago. In fact, when Russell McClellan was in office, I remember his brother, his communications advisor, Peter, calling me to see whether or not I'd be interested in tagging along a trade mission to Houston. And that was well ahead of that mission. In fact, we went, ended up, believe it or not, in the same minivan as the Premier as he was going off to visit a steel fabrication plant. That kind of access simply does not exist today.
Right, and it didn't just begin with Stephen McNeil. This is something that's evolved over time, and one could argue started in Ottawa and then has trickled down to the provinces. But if the government is going to argue that these trade missions are worth the money, and when you look at the way exports have just exploded over the last 6 or 7 years, it's difficult to argue they're not, then the least they can do is be upfront about who's going, when they're going, where they're going, and make that information easily accessible.
Don't tell me, show me.